I would like to invite Ramona to the podium and do her first presentation.
A warm welcome to you all. I'm glad that you're here, and I hope that going through the security procedures was not too troublesome. And I also hope that you enjoyed the mini tour that you got across the UN campus when our colleagues brought you over here, the 5 blocks through the labyrinth. Most of us here have vivid memories of Hurricane Sandy. Some of you may have had to evacuate your homes. Some of you may have had to deal with flooding, power outages, or fire, either at home or at your institutions. And some of you may still be undergoing repair work or struggling with insurance claims. I am here to tell the story of the impact that Sandy had on the UN. Let's consider for a moment where the UN is located. It's right on the East River. Sandy's most destructive force was the flood surge of salt water. And this map shows the flood levels in the area around the UN, and UN buildings were clearly affected by 3 to 6 feet of water right near the buildings. On 5 November, at a meeting of the UN General Assembly, senior managers gave a first accounting of the damage that had occurred. We had 2 feet of flooding on the 3rd basement level of several buildings. Electrical components of our chiller plants were destroyed. Electrical switchboards were damaged. 3 digital printers, large digital printers that provide about 95% of the documentation that needs to go to the different meetings, they were also destroyed beyond repair. And office equipment and furniture of office spaces on that level were also destroyed. Have a look at the photos that illustrate the flooding. This is in the 3rd basement here. See stuff floating, offices, staircase. And here you can see, like on the panel of the cubicle, the line, the water line. Due to the damage to some critical infrastructure, the following measures had to be taken. Heating and air conditioning systems had to be shut down. As a consequence, the primary data center was overheating and also had to be shut down. Then, as another consequence, they had to do like an abrupt data backup from the primary to the secondary data center. Then power was shut down for 1 day for 24 hours to prevent fire, and the buildings were closed from 29 to 31 October due to safety concerns. Let's watch a short clip from the statement of the Undersecretary General for Safety and Security, Mr. Starr, who gives us an impression of the situation.
As the Secretary for Management has said, was all over the ground. In our lower levels, we had in fact suffered some serious damage to our cooling systems and to our electrical systems. At that point in the morning, after some close coordination and collaboration between those of us on the emergency management team, we had to make a decision whether or not we could operate on Wednesday. I want to assure you that one of the things that is foremost in our minds at all times was how do we continue the important work of the United Nations, all of the sections, whether it's the committees, whether it's the General Assembly, whether it's the Security Council, whether it's the Secretariat. You know, we are an organization that is dedicated to global operations, be they political, humanitarian, development. And foremost in our mind is, can we get back to work? Well, the bottom line answer to us was not Wednesday. The situation that we were facing gave us very great concerns about the safety of putting people back into the buildings. We had suffered saltwater damage, and this is salt water coming up the river this far, in many of our electrical switch boxes and many of our electrical systems. We had fire alarm systems that were either going off every 5 or 10 minutes or not working at all. Our fire suppression pump systems were down as well, And as you're well aware, putting people into a 38-story building without proper fire protection, and when you're sitting there looking at switch boxes that are breaking out into fires or sparking and shutting themselves down, this caused us some great concern. We had to look carefully at the roof of the General Assembly building because
The day-to-day operations at UN headquarters at a time of peak activity in the General Assembly were severely impacted. The Security Council and General Assembly meetings were canceled from 29 to 31 October, except for an urgent Security Council meeting on Somalia that met in alternate spaces. An ad hoc printing operation had to be set up to supply documents for Security Council and General Assembly meetings, and IT applications were unavailable or unstable during the first days after staff had returned to work. In addition, the UN Secretariat remained severely understaffed, and this affected especially the recovery of IT systems. At that same meeting, the Undersecretary General for Management reported that overall the UN's emergency management framework had functioned properly and had enabled the organization to recover operations quickly. He accepted that some areas of the emergency management framework needed improvement and announced that the Secretary General had established a lessons learned task force that would review the emergency response to Hurricane Sandy and determine what steps could be taken to make the UN more resilient. In contrast, some member states expressed their dissatisfaction with the way in which the UN had handled the emergency situation. Delegates were particularly concerned about the assessment of damages and recovery of losses from insurance coverage, lack of direct communication with the member states' missions, an apparent failure to strengthen the resilience of UN buildings against natural disasters during the ongoing renovation project. You see, Maher pointed out that the General Assembly is still under construction. Extreme weather events due to climate change would become more frequent. The vulnerability and capacity of the UN's data centers and proper backup procedures, and an apparent failure to apply internally international best practices in disaster preparedness and recovery. And this is what a delegate from Denmark talks about in his statement.
On New York. My third point is probably a little bit more philosophical, but we do have an organization that puts a lot of emphasis on prevention. It's one of the Secretary General's key points for his second term. It's one of the key points of I think both the present and the former PGA. So it's one of the things that this organization really put an emphasis on. It's also clear that the word resilience is one of the key words for the operational activities of the system. It's clear that we put a lot of emphasis in follow-up on disaster, and disaster preparedness is one of the key planks of the UN. We try to work with golden standards, and we try to walk the talk, basically. When we initiated the Capital Master Plan, it was important to the Secretary General and to member states that the building basically became a state-of-the-art example of how to build, because we wanted the UN to display how to do things. And you can say that basically has not been the case in these circumstances. The whole issue of resilience, the whole issue of disaster preparedness, I think is something that we really need to look into. It's clear that it has been a blow to any kind of UN authority in that field, that we can't even manage our own business when it comes to a situation like this.
A few days later, the Secretary General briefed the General Assembly. In his statement, he identified extreme weather events related to climate change as a serious risk. He said, "Extreme weather due to climate change is the new normal. Our own eyes can see what is happening. There can be no looking away, no persisting with business as usual, no hoping the threat will diminish or disappear." After 20 years of involvement in international climate change research and negotiations to curb greenhouse gas emissions, Hurricane Sandy finally hit the message home. In March 2013, the Undersecretary General of Management presented an initial damage assessment to the member states. You can see the estimate for the cost of remediation work came to almost $150 million. Most of the cost would be recoverable under the organization's insurance plans. Senior management also proposed to take immediate mitigation measures that would make the UN headquarters more resilient to floods in the future. The proposed measures would add another $6 million to the bill and included moving critical electrical infrastructure and fire pumps to higher ground. Member states agreed in principle to those proposals, but urged the Secretariat to absorb expenses for remediation work not covered by insurance, as well as the cost for the proposed mitigation measures through efficiencies and savings. Just a quick note on the flood insurance. Before Sandy, we had $50 million of flood insurance. After Sandy, we were only able to obtain $20 million in flood insurance coverage. So that's the insurance market. That's how the insurance market changed. As of January 2014, remediation work was well underway and $64 million of related expenses had been recovered under the organization's insurance plans. A progress report on this work is due later in the fall. At the same meeting, the chef de cabinet, in her capacity as chair of the Lessons Learned Task Force, gave an overview of the findings of the after-action review of Storm Sandy. Whereas preparations for the storm were deemed good, the review brought to light several areas for improvement. Senior leaders needed to be more aware of their roles and responsibilities in the event of a crisis. We needed regular drills and exercises of the emergency procedures. Business continuity plans needed to be tested and updated regularly. We needed reliable backups of critical IT systems and effective communication protocols. And we should strengthen our cooperation with other UN agencies in New York in the event of a crisis. The chef de cabinet echoed earlier statements by the Secretary General and delegates that Hurricane Sandy had made it clear that the organization must prepare for impacts of catastrophic events related to climate change. Here's a clip from a webcast with our chef de cabinet.
Just to briefly emphasize something that was mentioned by some of the delegates, the connection between the storm and some of the larger discussion that the General Assembly has kept alive regarding climate change. I'm not an expert, but it's clear that the drawing is on the wall, that something is happening. When you look at the historic trends that were analyzed when it was assessed whether we will continue or not in the building, the historic trends showed no problem of any sort. And here we are now with this storm that has gone beyond any prior historic measurement. And this is only a proof and the reference to the preparedness of the city and not only the city, the state, both the states at large. This is an indication that what we are discussing in other fora are absolutely acutely related to what we went through in this storm, and only is a proof that we have to have a stronger preparedness and mitigating measures, because it's unlikely that insurance will address these problems to the level we will like them to do. Every indication shows.
A full report with the recommendations of the Lessons Learned Task Force was issued in February 2014. It was evident that serious efforts had been undertaken to make improvements, as most recommendations had already been implemented. The experience with Hurricane Sandy made it necessary to review and update a number of policies, procedures, and structures related to emergency management, as well as establish new ones. In particular, they related to risk assessment and treatment, infrastructure preparedness based on higher flood levels, business continuity, information technology, disaster recovery, identifying critical IT systems, providing conference services for priority meetings, crisis communications, training for senior leadership and critical staff, and the overall coordination of emergency operations. Many of the recommendations address the variety of communication and IT infrastructure problems experienced during and after the storm. The following measures were put into place. Enterprise critical systems are automatically backed up, including the UN intranet and key sections of the UN website. Websites can also now be updated remotely. The UN intranet has been migrated to Drupal, which is a more resilient platform. And an emergency website for staff and member states was created, providing key information on emergency preparedness. It also offers emergency alerts via a variety of communication channels. This is the new website. I think they put that up in the spring this year. The General Assembly was satisfied with the measures taken pursuant to the after-action review. One concern, though, remained. Member states felt that $20 million worth of flood insurance was insufficient and urged the Secretary General to obtain additional coverage. Now, to the library, what happened to us here? Maher has indicated, has kind of stolen my thunder a little bit, but prior to Hurricane Sandy, the Dag Hammarskjöld Library had experienced repeated flooding in areas of the third basement where our heritage collection of UN documents is housed. Here's like maybe an inch or so of water on the floor, and the next slide shows like the staining of the floor after if it had dried off. It was therefore not surprising that library staff were extremely concerned about the conditions in the library when the storm hit. Several library staff went to the UN complex on 31 October 2012 to check, but could not gain access to the library building. They stayed at the gate and requested information from security officers and facilities management personnel, but could not obtain an accurate report. Either later that day or early the next, library management and staff were relieved when they found out that the storm and the floodwaters had spared both the building and the collections. Whereas collections remained unharmed, day-to-day library operations were severely hampered for over a week due to the unavailability of critical IT systems, including our integrated library system and our web catalog. Other systems and services that the library relies on were also unavailable, especially those needed by our document indexers. In reference and research assistance, we initially had to rely on traditional reference tools, as neither the UN website nor reliable internet access was available. Library clients, both internal and from around the world, who use our web catalog to find and retrieve UN documents, soon began to complain that they could no longer access UN information, highlighting the fact that library systems needed to be considered critical to UN operations. Based on the experience during the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, the need for procedures to ensure continued operations during and after an emergency became clear, and the library has recently embarked on the development of a business continuity plan. In February of 2012, a preservation consultant conducted a needs assessment in the library. In his report, he highlighted the value of our collections. It is important that the library be considered as part of the critical infrastructure of the United Nations in future disaster planning, technology planning, budgeting, and staffing. The material in the library is of extremely high historic research and monetary value, but is not being treated as such. The big question that I would like to submit for our discussion later on is this: what is the value of a heritage collection such as ours, and how do we determine its value? How do we make sure that our heritage collections are recognized as critical assets to the UN, an organization that has played a key role in international cooperation for the past 70 years? Thank you for your attention to my presentation, and if you would like to learn more, in your packets is like a more extensive paper that I wrote, so with lots of references so you can knock yourselves out with learning about Sandy and emergency management at the UN. Thank you.